All right, so welcome everybody to the early Cold War. So we'll be going from 47 to about 1960 today. So talking about the early conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So part one will focus in on construction and confrontation. So these kind of dueling themes of trying to rebuild after the war, but also the tension that goes about as the U.S. and the Soviet Union struggle for dominance over the world. So a couple things. One is these are all the terms we'll talk about and the people and the events. So these are the things you should hopefully be familiar with by the end of watching and listening to this. So getting into the main ideas, there's an ideological or a struggle over ideas or concepts. And one is the Soviet way of doing things, and the goal is to spread worldwide communism. And there's an opposing idea that the United States wants to spread and keep, to some degree, communism at bay and wants to spread democracy. So they want to contain communism. They see it as a disease and it'll eventually collapse. And so some of the methods they use, both sides get pretty dirty in the Cold War. And so one, espionage, we'll talk more about spying, but the KGB and the CIA become renowned and famous for their exploits. There's going to be an arms race, which includes a nuclear escalation, but much more than that. And we'll see there's competition for the hearts and minds of what's called the Third World. So these are the people who don't make up communist or democratic governments. So this would be typically places like Latin America or Africa or different parts of Asia. So famously, in 1946, as it seemed like the Allies were breaking up and not any longer working together, there was a famous speech by Winston Churchill. He travels to the United States, and it is from Stettin in the Balkans to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that lies the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe. Essentially saying that the Soviet Union has had these places on lockdown, that he's not going to let go, Stalin that is, of these territories, won through World War II, and he's not going to give them up so that there's not going to be a repeat of German invasion again. And this idea is kind of metaphoric, but also fairly real. It was hard for people to get out of communist countries. Eventually, once the Soviets and their satellite states, all these countries get in power, and so there is some credence to this idea of a iron curtain. Moving on, there's some conflicts that happen around Europe after the war. So in particular, there's a civil war in Greece between communists and those who supported democratic ideas. And also Turkey was under the pressure, because they're a neighbor of the USSR, for concessions over the Dardanelles, basically the connection between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And the U.S. Wanted to support free peoples throughout the world who were resisting takeovers by armed minorities or outside pressures, meaning the Soviet Union. We must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. That is part of what will become what's called the Truman Doctrine. And essentially what that means is we're going to give money to places like Turkey and Greece. There's the good old American Tommy gun with... So we support people who we want to win in these conflicts. And so that is an early kind of look at some American actions that are going to take place. Moving on, rather than giving guns, we do help out people in a much more probably positive way. And the Marshall Plan is by George C. Marshall, the Secretary of State. And essentially he wanted his plan, because Truman was so unpopular, they actually slapped Marshall's name on there. But they wanted to repair war damage and dislocation in Europe, because they thought poor European nations were much more likely to become communist nations. And so they offered aid to all European countries, which was fairly generous at the time. And the U.S. Wanted to, so here's another quote, the U.S. should provide aid to all European nations that need it. This move is not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. And to some degree, this is a measure of goodwill, that the United States was the only major power in World War II not largely destroyed or affected, and so we had the means to offer it up, and we do. 12.5 billion dollars goes to Western Europe, but the USSR and its Eastern allies say no, thank you. We will remain fine just the way we are. So moving on, there's a kind of an expansion of this idea of containment, that communism is a bit of a disease by this guy, George F. Kennan, and basically he wants to stop communism without going to war, right? Because now a war means something significantly different after the atomic age, and so the containment doctrine is kind of expanded in what's called the NSC 68, but the National Security Council's report, 68 report, and it called for increased defense spending. So you can see the numbers go quite a bit up, from 13 to 50 billion, with basically tax increases. And this is really the framework for the next 20 years, which is fairly significant, that we're going to contain communism by spending a lot on our military, that the United States is going to be a world military power. And then there's this event in Berlin, which is behind the Iron Curtain that we just talked about, and essentially the Soviets cut off the roads, and they say you can't go to West Berlin, which is the capital was shared by East and West Germany, and so essentially the Western powers and the Americans, the French and the British, and the Soviets in the Eastern Berlin, and we'll see that the Americans decide they're going to fly planes over these three routes, and they're going to, for almost an entire year, drop supplies in every single day to feed and clothe and provide for people in West Berlin. And essentially, after a time, Stalin gives up and he opens back up the roads. Additionally, the Soviets get an A-bomb through some espionage. They steal U.S. technology, and they get an A-bomb in 1949. And so now these two powers are kind of equal once again, and there's two nuclear superpowers, which is kind of scary. And so we see these start to pop up all over the place. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but this idea of fallout and how do we protect ourselves against this looming threat. And so there's the creation of two organizations. So Stalin's aggressive actions, said that the U.S. needed military means to contain them, and so we get a bunch of our former allies to create a new club called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Essentially is a defense pact. I got your back, you got mine, and so we would all attack if attacked. And later on, West Germany joins, which was fairly controversial in '55, and the Soviet Union says, well, now we're going to create our own system, and we're going to call that the Warsaw Pact. And so we can look at it, a list of the countries a little bit later on. Spain will add, and this map is a little bit more updated. So now there are Eastern European countries that are a part of NATO as well. And the Warsaw Pact is essentially the Soviet Union with its nations here over in its border, and these nations served as what was called a buffer. Essentially, if they were going to get invaded, they'd have to go through these nations first. And there was another big moment here in the late 40s, and that is China was lost. So Truman was preoccupied with all this business that I was just describing in Europe, and so what ends up happening is the communists win in China. There was a civil war even before World War II, and then sort of a semi-pause during the war, and then the communists end up defeating the Republicans and those who supported democracy in China. And this was seen as a big blow because China was supposed to be a friendly nation, and so to the U.S., and now the U.S. is going to put more of its eggs in the Japanese basket, that is going to be our strong Asian partner. Moving on. Hold on one sec. Okay, and we're back. Come on, there we go. All right, And so one of the things that begins to happen is, having lost China, the United States takes a firm stance when North Korea launches an unprovoked attack on South Korea. And what ends up happening is the United Nations sanctions this as a police action. In fact, the president doesn't even declare war to go and fight for South Korea. And this ends up energizing people who were very strongly anti-communist. So the Korean War serves multiple purposes, and we end up expanding NATO forces quite a bit from, a 250,000 people to over 7 million people by the early 50s. And we'll see that the Korean War is kind of a seesaw sort of situation. So early on, the North Koreans make huge strides and they push all the way down, and this is the only part left that the South Koreans have. And then the United States supplies troops, and they head back and back, and they go all the way up until the Chinese get involved, and they launch their troops, and they push back and back and back, and eventually they end almost where the original border was, with the 38th parallel. So this is the armistice line right here. So we can see that the Korean War was brutal, but often didn't have the political outcome that either side probably had hoped for. So we'll see along the way, though, General MacArthur was in charge, and he gets kind of trigger happy, and he actually orders that China either make peace or prepare for war. And Truman ends up firing him because he doesn't want a war with a population as large as China. And the cost is really staggering, that the negotiations kind of lag on. It takes 2 years, and eventually they only sign what's called an armistice. This is not necessarily a peace treaty. It just means we're going to stop shooting at each other. So technically the Korean War never ended. So there's some significant loss of life by not so much the U.S., but certainly by South Korea and North Korea and the Chinese. Moving on, Nikita Khrushchev is going to take over. Stalin dies, and everybody's pretty pleased about that. But he's going to try to get rid of some of Stalin's era thuggishness and the ruthlessness, and try to get back to the true roots of communism. But when people resist, like the Polish and the Hungarians, he's going to crack down and make sure that they're under Soviet control. So we can see when Nagy, the Prime Minister of Hungary, promises free elections, the Soviet tanks roll in. Famous quote by Nikita Khrushchev about the capitalist states: "It doesn't depend on whether we exist. If you don't like us, you don't accept our invitations, but don't invite us to come see you. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." So a pretty bold statement in 1956. Some other events that prove to kind of highlight that the Cold War was active and hot in certain places. The Suez Canal connecting the Mediterranean and the Gulf gets cut or threatened to be cut by the Egyptians, and what ends up happening is American kind of take a backseat, but the French and the British get active, as well as the Israelis, in forcing Egypt to keep the Suez Canal open. The United States puts up what's called Radio Free Europe, but essentially broadcasting information to Soviet states as a pretty clear act of propaganda and trying to offer what they saw as free information. And last, the space race begins as Sputnik, the first satellite, is launched into space, and the Russians beat America to the space race. And so this will be a new part of the Cold War. Often there's also a kitchen debate, so we'll see that Nixon and Khrushchev kind of battle over who has the better nation and way of life. In 1959, these countries kind of offer some exchanges of what life is like, and that sort of ends as these debates get fairly heated. And last but not least, the Americans have a spy plane shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. Colonel Francis Gary Powers is shot down. He's tried as a spy and only adds to the tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So these are our terms. This is the stuff we talked about. You should be fairly familiar with it by now. Guys, have a good one.